Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
I mean,
I know you want to ban our national flags, but we're going to wave you goodbye.
What does confrontational mean? It means you'll fight for what you believe.
Enough was enough! And I said, let Trumpomania run wild, brother!
It is not merely our privilege to be strong, it is our duty to be strong.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Tripp. Thank you to everyone who is watching this. If you are watching this live on Facebook, Rumble, or YouTube, you can contribute to today's conversation through the live chat. You can also call in at some stage. At some stage today, I'll put the StreamYard link in the chat if you want to call in and ask a question or make a comment. We've got a big guest today, so this is a good opportunity for you to get involved in this conversation and have your say. It's just like Talkback Radio, except I call it Talkback Streaming. Now, to kick off, I want to let you know, just like I do every week, about how you can support everything that we're doing here at Commanding the Narrative by heading to Buy Me a Coffee. So if you want to head to Buy Me a Coffee, throw us a few dollars. It helps to pay for the stream, helps to pay for the website, and it also gives me a warm and fuzzy feeling inside, which is very important. So please head to Buy Me a Coffee and support us there. Also, if you want to stay up to date with everything that I'm doing and that we're doing at Commanding the Narrative and other places, head to commandingthenarrative.com. You can stay up to date with all our podcasts, Commanding the Narrative, Ex-Candidates, Global Discussion Forum, also any articles that I might write or appearances or events coming up. All this can be found at Commanding the Narrative. If you head up to the top right-hand corner and hit the sign-up button, you'll get a weekly newsletter with all that information. It's just the best way for all of you to keep up to date with everything that we're doing, because I hear that we're very harshly shadow banned on social media. So forget about the social media, head to the website and sign up. It's the best place to stay up to date. Just letting you know also about some big events coming up that are important. This one is coming up very soon, in 2 weekends' time. It's out in Oberon at the Lake Oberon Estate. If you head to lakeoberonestate.com.au and click the upcoming events tab, you'll come to the Climate Change and Energy Solutions Symposium. It's going to be some a big day, some important topics discussed. Oberon is facing a wind project out there. The community is pushing back against it. So this is part of it. Professor Ian Plimer will be speaking, Dr. Alan Moran, Grant Piper from the National Rational Energy Network, Paul Vallejo, Birchall Wilson has also been announced as well, and Anthony, who's organizing all this, former RAF fighter, also an engineer. He's going to be speaking, and I'll be hosting it. So if you can head out to Oberon, or if you're around that area, please join us. It should be a great event. And just lastly, just to finish off with all the housekeeping stuff, the Environment and Energy Forum, it's coming back. We'll ask to bring this out to Western Sydney. So this is going to be on September 29th between 1 and 5 p.m. So we've got some great speakers already announced. Kevin Lockray's coming down from Ballina. Wade Northhausen's going to be speaking. Craig Kelly, Steve Christou, Nick Cater's agreed, and also Matthew Kamanzuli, who's been quite outspoken in the last couple of days for good reason. They're all announced. We'll be announcing more speakers over the next few weeks. So if you want to find it on the Eventbrite, you can also head to the Environment and Energy Forum Facebook page to find all the links there. I'll put the links in the show notes as well. So you can come out and another great day at Guildford on September 29th. It's a Sunday, so hopefully we can all see you there. But on today's episode, I've got Dr. Frank Salter coming back. Now, I interviewed Dr. Frank Salter on episode 19. So if you want to learn more, if you enjoyed today's episode and you want to learn more, head back to that episode. He's a political scientist. He's a researcher. He's an expert in bioscience, behavioural biology, hierarchy, ethnicity. So with everything that's happening at the moment in England with the riots and other issues around the world as well, I think it would be a good opportunity to have him on and hear his expertise. So let's welcome him to the show. Dr. Frank Salter, welcome back to Commanding the Narrative.
Well, happy to be here. Hi, Steve.
Now, what's happening in the UK? I think some people are viewing this as in a vacuum. This is something that's been brewing for quite a while. Even back, I've got a copy of your book that you wrote with Harry Richardson here, Anglophobia. You write in the introduction that in the UK, thousands upon thousands of school-age girls were taken as actual sex slaves by gangs of men who were mostly of Pakistani origin. When the parents of these poor wretches reported these monstrous crimes to the police, they were ignored and turned away because, racism. So this has been something that the English community have been facing for a while. It's been brewing under the surface. What is your overall views of what you've seen in the UK based on your expertise?
There are two views of this murder, mass murder of little girls in Portsmouth in Western England. 3 girls were killed. I think 6 more were stabbed. 2 adults were in critical condition. And the sort of official multicultural view is the tragedy, of course, but these riots are simply irrational. For example, the next day, people were stoning a nearby mosque, but the alleged murderer, was not Muslim. So these people are obviously irrational, and what we see emerging is right-wing, far-right. In fact, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer called it far-right thuggery. So that's their view. My view is very similar to yours. This has been brewing for a long time. In fact, I'm somewhat surprised that the Anglosphere countries, Australia, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, America, have not rebelled earlier, because what has been happening is that the governments have been at an accelerating pace replacing, swamping the founding populations of those nations with indiscriminate immigration. I mean, by indiscriminate, I mean they might select on vocational grounds, perhaps. They might select on, make sure that people aren't actual criminals or terrorists themselves, but they don't discriminate in terms of identity. They don't select people who fit into our ancient Christian culture. And so it comes as no surprise to me this has happened. Now, the murder of the 3 little girls acted as a trigger. And this is something that the left, the official multicultural view, just doesn't get. It's a trigger. They've been pushing us in this direction for maybe half a century, since the 1960s in America, since the 1970s in Australia. The population has been diversifying, ever more diversifying, and diversity is not our greatest strength. These people live by slogans. the reality is diversity is problematic. There are problems with it. Now, the usual academic source for making that statement is Robert Putnam, Professor Robert Putnam at Harvard University, who wrote a brilliant study, first announced it in 2006 and then published it the next year, in which he showed it was a live-scale study, I think 30,000 participants. This is a large database in America, and he found that the more diverse a city or a community, the lower the trust of public officials, the trust of the corner shop, the trust of police, and therefore the lower the social cohesion. So social cohesion was inversely related to the diversity. And but this was not a new idea. I myself had published, and my team had published 2 books on related subjects, making the same claim. We found the same, reached the same conclusion based on theory, biological theory, treating humans as an evolved species that evolved in homogeneous communities that were homogeneous religiously, culturally, racially. And so from that point of view, it's not surprising that we'll be unsettled, to put it mildly, as diversity grows. But this finding went back, well, a few years before I published these books. I'm thinking of Rudolf Rummel, R-U-M-M-E-L, Rummel, Rudolf Rummel. He was a professor of political science at the University of Hawaii, very well respected, a senior scholar by this stage. In 1997, he published a correlation study of diversity and civil war. He was interested in civil war. People don't realize it, but civil war is the bloodiest form of warfare. Conventional battles between armies are terrible, terrible things. But if you really want to see large loss of life, civil war, for example, the American Civil War of the 1860s killed 600,000 to 700,000 people, more than any other war in America's history. And this was when it had a population of something like 20 million people. So it was a massive wound in that country. And by the way, that was a war indirectly over race, by the way, that Civil War. So what Rummel found was that he had various hypotheses of what causes civil war. The most powerful driver of civil war is lack of democracy. Okay, so countries where people can't blow off steam, where they can vote their interests and they can vote the government out of office, for example, and bring in a fairer government, those countries are the most likely to slip into civil war. The second variable was ethno-linguistic diversity. Okay, and he found that he remarked, it is amazing that one variable can explain so much of the variance. Something like 40% of the variance was explained by one variable. But he said there's a reason for hope, and the reason for hope is that as long as we've got democracy, and all Western societies at that stage in the late 20th century were democracies, and he said as long as we preserve democracy, people can blow off steam, but they can vote the government out of office that's displeasing them, and we don't have to have civil war. I commented at the time, I noted the article, and I commented at the time, that's great, but notice the proviso that we must preserve democracy. And that is precisely what has been in long-term decline in the West, across the Anglosphere, for example, which concerns us most. Democracy has been in decline. Why do I say that? Well, let's just look at Australia, for example. The Australian voters since the 1970s have not had the opportunity to vote on immigration. And this is an open secret. Prime Minister, 2 prime ministers that back to back, Malcolm Fraser said, not only have we avoided people voting on immigration and multiculturalism, they should not be allowed to vote on it because they always get it wrong. We bring in basically immigrants, whoever we want to bring in, by we, he means the government, we bring in whoever we want. And there's a couple of nutcases complain, but they settle down and they get used to it. Bob Hawke went a step further. Bob Hawke, on the other side of politics, he was the next prime minister after Malcolm Fraser. And Bob Hawke said, you know, what we've done with immigration, we're transforming Australia. It would have been impossible if we'd ever given them the vote. If we'd ever said to the Australian people, do you want to be replaced in your own country? Do you want Australia to become a highly diverse, multicultural society? Do you want to replace our traditional immigration policy, which was the Immigration Restriction Act 1901, which made sure that immigrants who came in shared basic Western identity with the native born. And Hawke said we could not have done it if we hadn't had an agreement under the table between the major political parties. Bipartisanship, he called it, bipartisanship, where both parties agree, let's not make immigration an election issue. Let's just quietly impose our wishes on the Australian people. And the same has been happening in Britain. One reason for this riot, back to these riots, what has helped build up this passion, this anger in Britain, is that they voted in what they thought was a conservative government back in 2010, 2012. They voted in 14 years ago anyway, so it's 2010, specifically to deal with the immigration crisis. Immigration was a fraction of what it is now in Britain. Now they're bringing in something like 800, 900,000, a million a year. And people just won't cop it anymore. They are just so angry. And they voted in, and the Conservative Party promised to reduce immigration from hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands, to basically stop immigration, to pause it. They knew what people wanted. They promised election after election after election. And they did the opposite. When they got into power, they did the opposite. And anyone who complained was called the usual thing that Nigel Farage is called, that Tommy Robertson is called, a racist, bigot, white supremacist, and so on. Basically, the media is an attack dog for the multicultural left, with exceptions. So people have experienced this pent-up rage, and I'm just taken back to this research by this.
Sorry, just to cut in before you get to that research, Brexit was a big part of that as well.
Exactly.
One of the main issues with Brexit was that people within the European Union can travel across borders without restriction, and they were facing a lot of Romanians coming into the UK, which the UK population weren't happy about. So that's what really fueled the Brexit movement. I mean, there were multiple reasons, but that was a big part of it. Brexit comes in, and the British people assumed that these immigration levels would stop. But instead of taking people from Europe, then they started taking people from the rest of the world. So
yeah, exactly. And Nigel Farage, who was the main man behind Brexit, he acknowledges that immigration was basic. And to his credit, he's tried to pay attention to immigration. He was the first politician to go down to Dover, down to that opposite the French coast, and observe the Royal Navy escorting boats, bringing people in who'd illegally come across the channel to Britain, to England. And he observed that. He saw that they were putting them in hotels. This is driving people crazy. They have people on the street, homeless people. Housing prices have gone mad in Britain under these pressures, the way they have in Australia as well. And there are homeless people. There are servicemen who serve the country who have mental illness problems, are on the street, can't feed themselves. And yet illegal immigrants who come to Britain are very well treated indeed. They receive housing, they receive a stipend, monthly stipend, and this can go on for years. So there's anger there, and this was predicted by Professor Rummel, Professor Putnam, and explained. I think the original explanation came before me. I should acknowledge it. It's an Australian professor of political science, Professor David Brown, and he in 2000 wrote a book in which he tried to explain what multiculturalism was. And he argued that multiculturalism is where the government shifts its allegiance from the people, from the majority, as you'd expect in a democracy. Who does the government serve? Well, it should guarantee the rights of all people, all citizens, but serve the policies chosen by the majority. That's the definition of democracy. And Brown said that he noted that under multiculturalism, the reverse happens. A reverse ethnic hierarchy is established where the government shows allegiance to minorities and basically suppresses expressions of identity and interests by the majority when it comes to ethnic affairs, immigration, multiculturalism, affirmative action, equal opportunity, that sort of thing. So we have a perfect storm developing. The perfect storm is this insane diversity against the interests of the majority at a time we've known for 2 to 3 decades that diversity has severe political costs. At the same time, suppressing democracy. It's the worst possible combination. And the result is what we're seeing in Britain. And it's not easy to be optimistic about Britain now.
And I should remind people, it was only a few years ago we saw the riots after the George Floyd killing. So these racially motivated events are common. I mean, they happen all around the world. I guess the most basic question to understand why this happens is, if we are all human beings, why do we divide into groups? Why is that important for humans? Or maybe is it a biological thing that we just can't resist?
Well, the larger the group, the more amenable they are to over centuries being fused together or split apart and so on. So it's a dynamic process. But the analogy I like to use to give a grip on this is the family. Imagine if you rephrase your question, why is it if we're all just human beings, we divide ourselves among families? I think most people would immediately say, well, because I love my mummy and daddy and they love me, I'm their children, they look after me, that's just natural, isn't it? Yes, it is natural. It is natural. And the thing about an ethnic group, which is the basis of nationhood, nations are formed around dominant ethnic groups, sometimes close to 100% of the population, but generally not. Generally 70% or 80% or 90% of the population. Most nations have at their core an ethnic group. Ethnic groups are extended families. They're defined by descent. That was an insight made by the great German sociologist Max Weber. He pointed out that he argued, I think correctly, that people cohere when they perceive others to be descended from the same ancestors. So that tends to create what he thought was a fictive kinship bond. He didn't believe it was true because he wasn't a biologist. We now know it is true. We now know that ethnic groups, in fact, are genetically related. Randomly chosen pairs from an ethnic group have genes in common. And it's not slight. It's typically at the level of first cousins, which is pretty high, sharing 1/8 of your genes, right? Mm. So that's pretty significant. So the analysis of these things is not complete, but we're moving ahead, and we know some things now we didn't know fairly recently. For example, that ethnic kinship is robust. It can be really strong, depending on the comparison being made. Now, when a country regulates its immigration, by the way, as most countries do, China, India has an ethno-nationalist government. China has an ethno-nationalist government, right? Replacing Marxism as the dominant ideology. Now it's Confucianism, which is a form of idealized kinship doctrine. So these countries do. They want immigrants to be compatible. Now, one logic of that is if you choose related ethnic groups to come into your country, ethnic kinship is very low. That makes it within your country, ethnic kinship is kept low, and that's conducive to democracy. Democracy is not promoted by radically multicultural societies where you have where the population is made up of different tribes, and those tribes is each like an intense family, genetically related and culturally related family. Democracy is best in a homogeneous population. The next best thing is made up of ethnic groups that are closely related. For example, ancient Greece. Ancient Greece, they knew that they all spoke the same language with some different accents. But they had, fierce tribal differences, the Spartans versus the Athenians and so on. But when an external threat came, such as the Persians, they were joined together. They realized they actually were the one nation, but with some tribal differences. Now that's better than what we have in Australia and Britain right now, which is radical diversity, genetic and cultural, being built up by the government against the wishes of the people. That's an important point to be made. It's an undemocratic outcome. It's being done against the known wishes. And how do they justify this to themselves, the elites? My impression is that they have this, they've imbibed this cultural Marxist notion that white people in particular are bigoted, racist. They have to be, they're hopelessly parochial. This has to be overcome. We have to break the back. One leading bureaucrat, senior bureaucrat, I'm trying to remember his name, who worked with both Bob Hawke and he worked with Malcolm Fraser, declared his goal back then. He said, I want to break the back of Anglo-Australia, of Anglo-Saxon Australia. I want to break the back. No, sorry, I got that wrong. I want to break the back of white Australia. Mm-hmm. Quote, I want to break the back. Malcolm Fraser said, I'm with you. A prime minister said, I'm with you. So there's this ideological antagonism to Europeans for some reason. Now, I don't know why, but one can go in. I can just mention correlations, like these people are typically on the left somewhere. And this ideology has been spread primarily by our universities. Mm. So there are experts who've looked at this. One expert, for example, this sociologist living in Britain, is Canadian, Professor Eric Kaufman, has traced this back, this ideology back, and it's come predominantly, not only, but predominantly through the universities, which then train professionals in the media, who then take jobs in the media, who then profess this ideology, and it tends to be a self-reinforcing loop. But so we're not sure. I'm not sure where this hatred has come from, but it does seem to be there.
I'm reminded. I know. I think it was Ronald Reagan, one of the American presidents, said, "If we're ever faced with an alien invasion here on Earth, then all the races will unify." And there's a scene in the movie Independence Day where the humans are finally going to have their final counterattack, and it's got an image of the Israelis and the Palestinians basically at the same airfield coordinating attack with each other, and they're just looking at each other going, we're working together now. My mother studied psychology, and you feel free to disagree with this, but one of the things she told me when I was growing up was that if you just had an all-white society, then it would divide even further. So you would divide, people with orange hair would be excluded, or people with brown eyes or brown hair would be different than people with blue eyes and blonde hair. So there seems to be this thing within humanity where we want to divide into smaller and smaller groups, or based on the circumstances. If we have a sense of belonging in our biology, is there also a counter need for an adversary? Is that embedded within humanity, where no matter the circumstances or no matter our situation, we always need some sort of adversary?
I think there's some truth in that. I think that having a common enemy does drive people together. I think that's true. However, diversity itself is divisive. Diversity itself does tend to atomize a society. Now, I think evidence of what I'm giving is not contradicting Mum, but I'm giving a softer interpretation of that. Yes, it's a factor. People can form tribes on all sorts of bases, but typically they have an ancestral basis to them. Now, why I think we need to soften that approach about divisiveness and so on is the way class politics has given way to identity politics in the last half century. Now, the radical left, used to be all about class solidarity. Okay, so that's the core of Marxism. All that matters is whether you're a proletarian or whether you're a capitalist, whether you're part of the middle class, of the bourgeoisie. Which are you? Make your stand. Where on the side of the working class? That is given way now, after the Frankfurt School of the 1930s and other developments and other writers realized that they were, in their horror, they saw that ordinary working class people and lower middle class people across the West kept voting conservative. They kept voting along national lines. They weren't meant to do that, according to Marxian theory, much of which is rubbish anyway. But these people believe in Marxism. So in the First World War, all the socialist parties voted to support the war efforts of their respective countries. In the Second World War, in the 30s, leading up to the Second World War, to their horror, the communists looked on as the working class first supported Mussolini's fascists in Italy. Mussolini was a socialist who defected to the right and took much of the working class movement with him. And then they saw Hitler receive much support from the working class as well. And this is not meant to happen in Marxian theory. And so a shift. The intellectuals of the left began working on changing their theory, and they shifted over to this has happened in reality, shifted over to identity politics, right? Because the white working class kept on disappointing them. They just weren't doing what they were supposed to do, which is vote against their national interests. So we now have identity politics led by the left. By the way, it's not this racial politics we see around us is a product of the left. The right was effectively defeated by the cultural left by the 1960s and 70s. So what we're seeing is a remarkable shift to identity politics, and I think that has been a contributor to these riots and to the upset we're seeing in multicultural societies around the world.
Got a question here from Struth Dundee. I love that name for some reason. What are the overall negative effects of diversity?
Diversity, the costs of diversity, I've published multiple research papers on it. The costs of diversity, the cause is that people detect difference. They're detecting difference. And so the basic formula goes like this, and I refer to the groundbreaking work by Pierre Vandenberg. Pierre Vandenberg was a colleague and a friend. Grew up in Europe and in Belgium, and spent most of his professional life in America. And he talked about ethnic markers. Ethnic markers. The formula goes, or the model goes something like this: when other people around you have your own, have the ethnic markers that you have, then you feel included. You feel you're among your tribe. When they don't, your feelings of altruism, your feelings of trust begin to weaken. So homogeneous societies, yes, they can have there are class conflicts, for example. There is the wealthy, there can be the poor, there can be the criminal, there can be the law-abiding, there can be corruption, all that sort of thing. There are many causes of conflict, but they don't have that extra cause of conflict, which is different ethnic markers. So let's talk about ethnic markers just briefly. It's very simple, straightforward. There are culturally derived ethnic markers and genetically derived ethnic markers. The genetic ones are pretty obvious. Shared race, shared skin color, facial structure, hair form, body odor, relative limb length, height. All these things can act as markers that you belong to a different descent group. That's why they're genetic, because these are ethnicity as a descent group. Okay, cultural mark. There are far more cultural markers, and they're at least as powerful as the genetic ones. In many cases, more powerful. Religion is conveyed, is passed down culturally. It's not a genetic thing. It's passed down culturally. What about tooth filings? Some cultures leave the teeth. Some file them, according to tribal tradition. What about dress? The way you dress. Among hunter-gatherers, they have styles of arrowheads, styles of feathers. The way it's done is taken as an ethnic marker. Language is a big one. Language is a big one, and accent. So people can speak the same, even when they speak the same accent. So one might have a heavy Glaswegian accent, and the other one have an upper class English accent, and that's a reason for mistrust and so on. So all these cultural ethnic markers, and they all add up they can all operate at once, and some can work for amity, for friendship, and some go in the opposite direction. A typical example would be where someone presents with radically different racial markers, radically different racial appearance, right? And in a static frame, one might say, "Oh boy, they're very different," and then they talk, and they're both talking with a broad American accent, or an English or an Aussie accent, and that language does so much to soften the sense of difference. Someone who's speaking the same language as you with the same accent, it's difficult not to think this is another human being. This is another one of a part of my tribe. Looks a bit strange, might look a bit strange, but I might get used to that to an extent. Okay, so now the left position, there are, like Vandenberg himself was a man of the left. And in his theory, he liked to think, we talk about this sometimes, we became friends, and he felt that the cultural markers could override the racial. And I think that's true. Emphasis on can. They can override, but often they don't. So, in many parts of the world, genetic cultural markers, in fact, have a big effect. People take them very seriously. Now, one might say they ought not take them seriously. That's wrong. They shouldn't take them seriously. That's actually not relevant. Where if one is interested in what people actually do, right, then morality does not have a place in description. So it's an ethnic markers, I think, need to enter the debate here about multiculturalism.
It's interesting when you talk about the culture and like people having the same accent and speaking the same language. Could that be if you identify someone as being very similar to you in terms of accent and the way they speak, you automatically assume that they have grown up in the same culture as you, so therefore they have the same belief systems, they practice the same adherence to the law, they might have the same views on cleanliness and maybe keeping their environment sanitary and whatever, whereas people that are different are unpredictable, so they may even be more advanced or more further along than you are, but you don't even realize that. You just think, here's an outside force that I don't know anything about. This is unpredictable to me. And I think it was Jordan Peterson was talking about this once. He said there's an inbuilt aversion to people of other races or other cultures, because back in the day, say, for example, the Spanish would rock up in South America and then wipe out majority of the South Americans because they brought new diseases that the South Americans hadn't been exposed to before. They didn't have an immunity to that. So a lot of it had to come down to cleanliness and a fear of not a hatred of other cultures or other races, but a disgust of other races, because there was that, I guess, almost ancestral thing of, when you are exposed to another race, you're exposed to these new pathogens that you have no immunity to. Is there any part of that shows up in your research?
Yeah, it's basically true, I think. I didn't look into the medical disease factors, but I've read about them, read that research, and it sounds plausible. We've just recently, our civilization developed antibiotics, for example. We've only developed recently scientific medicine. People had to look out for themselves until very recently. And a stranger who speaks a different accent, language, or has a different accent, who might have different cleanliness habits, different cooking habits, that's all a threat to a society where the individual has to look out to avoid pathogens, him or herself. And so, it was a matter of survival to associate with people from your own group. Okay, so and there's also another evolutionary mechanism there, which is people might have heard the term inbreeding depression. If you marry your sister, if you have children with an uncle, or a close family reproduces together, the results can be disastrous, because you have recessive negative genes, recessive mutations that normally mask because they're recessive, Mendelian recessive, that they don't express themselves. But when you receive one from both parents, then it can be disastrous. And so that's why it's actually illegal to marry a sibling. It's actually illegal. And it's illegal for a parent to marry a child, and this sort of thing. Okay, so it's facing biological reality. Well, there's also a thing called outbreeding depression. Most people haven't heard of it. Outbreeding depression. Now, if you look at populations that have been resident in a place for millennia, and most of us come from, for example, European Australians came from Europe, and they were there for sometimes 30,000 years if you take some ancestors, 10,000 years if you take others. So for many, many thousands of years, then it tends, a population, for example, builds up resistance to endemic pathogens, diseases. Okay, and also if that's a cultural zone, then that population will tend to build up adaptations to get along, to survive in that cultural zone. It might have rule of law, so one has to be restrained. It might there might be cooking rules, and so on. So outbreeding depression is where one marries someone from a radically different culture and gene pool, right, who might not carry adaptations to your particular local environment. So your children will be less adapted. This is theoretical. Your children will be less adapted to that cultural zone or to the endemic diseases from that swampy area or that dry area or whatever the cause. So there's inbreeding depression. There's also outbreeding depression. That's one reason given for what is found, which is that most people's marriage partner choices, and this has a big impact on ethnic affairs, on multicultural affairs, because it determines whether two populations merge over a few generations or whether they remain separate. Intermarriage is the most thorough form of assimilation that we have. So anything which slows down intermarriage, we should know about. And it could be that one thing keeping people apart, causing a lack of trust, a degree of contempt or disgust or fear, could be along these lines. That it's a resistance to intermarrying with people who would result in the outbreeding depression of one's children.
Look, I think it's important to understand the innate biological inbuilt reactions that we as humans have. I mean, a lot of people view events like what's happened in the UK very emotionally, or at times maybe irrationally. Whereas I mean, these are very complex issues. But I do want to talk about, we're seeing immigration become another big issue here in Australia. It's a massive issue in the United States, with apparently people streaming across the border without any sort of resistance or pushback from the American authorities. And as you mentioned before, over 1 million people a year, or up to 1 million people a year in the UK coming into that country. Why is it expected that these countries with a white majority should take such large amounts of immigrants, where we don't really see that happening in other countries around the world?
It's a big question. That's for me, that's a key question. I don't have a simple answer for it. I just have some talking points like everyone else. Why is it let's first put your question in different ways, express it in different ways. One way to ask the same question is, why have so many Western elites come to hate their own populations? Why?
Well, Keir Starmer
in India,
far right thuggery.
Yeah. Why? For example, before he was elected president, about 8 years before he was elected president, while he was vice president under Barack Obama, Biden gave a famous reply. It's on YouTube. One can look it up. It's on YouTube, where he talked about how good it was that his type of people of European descent, would soon become a minority in the United States. Why? Because relentless, year after year, mass immigration coming, unstoppable. You wouldn't want to stop it. Why? Because diversity is our greatest strength. Now, when I look at that, I think the man is either a traitor or a moron, or both, perhaps. But I have to be careful with harsh judgments like that, because it's a very common view among the cultural left. Where did this come from? Where does it come from? The idea that it's somehow good for people to become a minority in their own countries. It's bizarre. This is bizarre. This needs explanation. I don't have a complete explanation, but I don't pretend to. But at least I think we should recognize how strange this is. And this began to infect Australia as well, because we're part of the global, community of Western nations. And these ideas can spread, and they have spread. Why would one theory I have, I don't know whether it's true or not, but one theory is based on my own experience of universities since the 70s. And I'm now retired, but I have a long history in universities. And I was in studying political science, sociology, those related topics, history. And the social sciences and humanities are radically divorced from biology. I do believe this is a factor, at least one key factor. How, for example, when in my political science training, undergraduate, then doctoral student, I was not required to learn anything about human nature, about human biology. Just extraordinary. It's just extraordinary when you think. And in 1996, I reviewed the concise Oxford Dictionary of Sociology. One can look it up still. You can find it still. The concise Oxford Dictionary, a thick paperback. And I read through there, and I reviewed it because I was trying to get a grip on different theories of ethnicity, and I wanted to take an evolutionary approach, a biological approach that did talk about human nature. And it was radically divorced. This illustrious dictionary of sociology admitted, so to speak, it was there for all to see, that it was divorced from human nature. Okay, so in fact, it labeled people who did try and bring human nature in as a variable to try and explain, for example, race differences. And is that coming from you or me?
I think that's you.
I think it's my fire alarm going off.
Yeah, we can take a pause if you want.
Take a pause.
Just in case your house is burning down or something like that. I guess I should take this opportunity to let you know that Dr. Frank Salter is part of the British Australian community. You can head to their website, britishaustraliancommunity.com.au, if you want to learn more about what Dr. Salter is doing, and also Harry Richardson and a whole bunch of people there at the British Australian community. You can head to their website. Also, they've got a great YouTube channel as well. Again, the British Australian community. I want to try and talk to Dr. Salter about this apartheid series that he recently had, but it looks like he's back.
The fire is extinguished.
Maybe what you're talking about is too hot to handle or something.
It's incendiary. Let's face it, it's incendiary.
Yeah.
And I'll just finish this point about the universities, social sciences and humanities. I had this experience at Sydney University when I was doing my honours, and I said to the professors, look, I want to do a thesis on bringing in human nature, genetics, in particular genetic theory of evolution, into studying politics. And they said, you what? They could not believe it. And they said, there's no professor who knows enough about biology to do that. And I said, okay, I'll find one. So I went over to the other side of the campus building and knocked on the door of a professor of insects who studied the genetically based behavior of insects. And I said, look, would you mind supervising my political science thesis? And he agreed. he agreed. He said, that sounds interesting. He'd never thought of that before. So I was going to do a thesis that compared human societies to ant hives. That was the idea. I never did, but that was the idea, to just try and tease out some similarities and differences. So I went back to my professors in political science, and they said, "Oh, this has gone too far. We can tell you that if you do that, you'll do very badly. Your thesis will do very badly in the exams. We'll mark it very badly." I said, "Okay." I gave up, and just did I studied Max Weber or something, some sociological nonsense that, well, not Max Weber's not nonsense, but I towed the line. But I think this is a major cause of our problems, that our leaders, whether they be senior public servants or whether they be the head of corporations or whether they be teachers or lawyers or other professionals or politicians, most are subject to elite culture, and elite culture was dominated by in effect, the Marxist left by the 1960s. Eric Kaufman, in his book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, argues that it happened by the 1950s. The university humanities, departments of humanities and social science were dominated by left liberals by the 1950s.
That's probably a good segue, because I want to focus on the tactics of the left. And on this issue, I think about countries like maybe the Philippines or Thailand, or you mentioned India before, where I guess their culture and their race is confined to one country. So they really need to protect that if they want to maintain a majority status. I wonder how they would react if they were seeing large amounts of immigration. And one of the terms that gets thrown around is this great replacement theory. I want to bring up Britannia. Now, when I was growing up, Britannia was kind of put on a pedestal of, being an encyclopedia. This is their definition of replacement theory. It says, in the United States and certain other Western countries where populations are mostly white, a far-right conspiracy theory alleging in one of its versions that left-leaning domestic or international elites on their own initiative or under the direction of Jewish co-conspirators are attempting to replace white citizens with non-white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, or Arab immigrants. The immigrants' increased presence in white countries, as the theory goes, in combination with their higher birth rates as compared with those of whites, will enable new non-white majorities in those countries to take control of national political and economic institutions, to dilute or destroy their host country's distinctive cultures and societies, and eventually to eliminate the host country's white populations. Some adherents of replacement theory have categorized these predicted changes as white genocide. That's Britannia. That's in Britannia. Now, we can see large levels of immigration. I mean, it's just mathematical that if this continues, then the white populations of Australia, America, the UK, and other places will become majority. After all, I mean, I think it's 7% of the world population is white, so we're a minority to begin with on a world scale. What is your opinion of that definition in Britannia?
I was using the concept of replacement biologically, right? So in the animal kingdom, there's dynamic balance. Some populations can rise and fall depending on various factors, the changes in the weather, the introduction of a new virus, and so on. I was using it as you do, in a descriptive way, just what I'm observing. I see one population falling in numbers, in relative numbers, and another increasing in relative numbers. Predictable when you have open borders immigration from countries like India and China with populations over 1 billion people each, and we have a population. Many countries have small populations, like Australia, 26 million or 27 million. So I was using it in the descriptive sense Now, the Great Replacement theory is based on a book written by a Frenchman, I think. I've never read it. I've never read it. It just sounds I have to agree with the excerpt, or the thrust of the excerpt you just read from Britannia. It's these grand conspiracy theories just sound like nonsense to me. But I think a theory is not the same as description. One can describe what one sees without having a theory of why it's happening. And that excerpt you read from that, or that comment was made on Great Replacement theory, is very theoretical. Very theoretical, that these elites are getting together and they're trying to do this and do that. Well, that might or might not be true. Nevertheless, replacement is happening. It is happening. And if it's having bad effects, then it's legitimate to oppose those changes, whatever one's theory is about who's doing it or who's not doing it, and so on.
I should correct myself. It's Britannica. I said Britannia. It's Britannica.
Britannica.
So I got that wrong. I guess the reason I bring that description up is to highlight how the left try and smear anyone who is against large-scale immigration. And it seems that they put these narratives out there, or they'll use terminology like far right or conspiracy theorist, or they'll have articles about this Great Replacement theory. So if you do pop up and you start pushing back against large scale immigration, they'll say, "Oh, he's a conspiracy theorist and he believes in the Great Replacement theory," and then they'll start putting these words in your mouth. And we're seeing that in the UK. I mean, Keir Starmer has called the protesters far right. I mean, does protesting immigration have to be a political viewpoint? I mean, some of these people probably just don't want to see violence in their communities. I mean, this was all predicated on a man, a 17-year-old, walking into a party where some girls were doing some dancing and yoga, and he stabbed a whole bunch of them. I mean, killed 3 of them. How does that become political? I mean, why is these terms like far right and conspiracy theorists and these theories like Great Replacement theory, why are these bandied around to? Is the attempt to put people in a box to I guess cancel them out of the debate?
Well, one cause, it's a good question. One cause is that Starmer and his ilk are far left. Whether what they've said about the far right is all true or not, it's certain that he's on the far left. And one feature of the far left is that they will make no concessions to their own people's survival and welfare, their fundamental survival and welfare. So what disappointed me about that speech by Starmer was not that he was criticizing right-wing thugs. There were right-wing thugs. They were rioting. They were punching police officers and so on. That's unacceptable.
Throwing bricks and
it's
stuff
simply
like
unacceptable. Throwing bricks and throwing stones at mosques and so on. It's unacceptable. What I wanted to hear from him was, I feel the pain of those much larger numbers of people who are just feel they're losing their country. They're trying to vote against immigration, but the government keeps pushing it up. They've committed no crime. They've done nothing wrong. They might have different politics to me, but I'm just one person, and I'm Prime Minister. And I'm governing for everyone. So yes, people who peacefully demonstrate, I respect that, and I'm listening. And you're telling me you don't want more foreigners in the country. You've got enough. Thank you very much. That's legitimate. He could not make that step, and that's something that the left is. There's not a single left, by the way. The leftists include a great expressions of love for truth, of tolerance, and so on. And that's the Australian tradition too. It's this Marxist, hate-filled, intolerant left that's doing so much damage, and it's taken over. It's taken over much of the left, or at least the visible left. Where are the leftist figures? Imagine if Starmer had said that. Look, I wholeheartedly condemn the violent rioters. I'm sure no one supports them, but for the millions of people who are opposing, who don't want to become a minority in their own country, I think that's legitimate. He might say, I don't share that view. I don't think it matters whether we become a minority. But he should not necessarily condemn those who do care about that. So it's this intolerance, and I think that's been a marked feature of the growth of the anti-national left since World War II. This intolerance, and I don't know how much of that can be attributed to Leninism. I don't mean John Leninism, which is a lot of people have that idea. I mean the original Lenin from 1917 from Russia. Was this absolute intolerance of political opponents. And that's not our tradition. Our tradition is, look, I really hate what you're saying, but okay, I'll shut up now and let you have a talk, and then I'll try and oppose your argument and so on. This idea, very British, of the loyal opposition. The loyal opposition. They're worthy of our respect. We disagree with them politically. We have different interests and so on, but we form the one country, and so we pay basic respect, and that's the ruling elite, which is far left in effect, has lost that, and it's one reason, I think, why we've lost our universities and lost our mainstream media, because of this intolerance.
Mike G's trying to stir the pot in the chat. He said, what narrative are you commanding? Well, commanding the narrative is a bit of a play on words, and I feel like there's a lot of narratives that we're up against, whether it be climate change or whatever it might be. So I guess the commanding narrative platform is meant to be about having these conversations, having adult conversations, presenting arguments, and then let the viewers make up their mind. Don't just put out a narrative and say, well, if you disagree with it, you're this name or you're that name or whatever. We need some more discernment in our politics and in our society. So that's where the name really came from. But Dr. Salter, you're doing some fantastic work at the British Australian community. Recently, you did a 3-part series on apartheid with Professor Eric Lowe. I absolutely love this series. You released it over a period of time, and as I would watch one of them, I couldn't wait for the next one to be released, because some of the information that the professor was putting forward, and he lived in South Africa, he saw this firsthand for a lot of it, was stuff that I hadn't heard of before. For example, the indigenous race of South Africa weren't black at all. They were the Bushmen. They were yellow skinned. So I mean, just little facts like that was very, very interesting to me. So I'm going to blame you. I'm going to blame you for this, because when I would watch one and I'd be waiting for the next one to come along, I was hungry for more information. So I turned to YouTube and I typed in apartheid, and I wanted to learn more about it. I came across this lecturer in Austin. His name is Dr. Roy Casagranda, I think is how to pronounce it. I'm hopeless at pronouncing names. And I found it very interesting. You could tell he was on the left, and I think this is an example of what's happening in our universities. What he would do is he would present a whole bunch of a lecture on the history of apartheid in South Africa, which was very interesting, similar to the professor that you interviewed. Giving the background, giving the history was interesting, and it definitely captured my attention. But every now and again, he would just insert this little nugget of ideology, and it would be quick, and then he would move on from it. And I think this goes a long way to how these lecturers and academics indoctrinate our youth. I'm going to provide an example. Now, I don't know if you're going to agree with what he said or disagree, but I think I'll play it, and then I'll get your view on what he says here.
Nationalist state. So for those of you who aren't clear about what nationalism is, this is the nutshell definition. It's different from patriotism. I think in general, because we're really sloppy with the language, right? We use them interchangeably all the time and people are confused. So patriot says, I love my country. If you say I love X, that doesn't mean you hate Y and Z and R and S and T and A and B and C. It just means you love X. You're done. It's not exclusive state. Nationalism is very different. Nationalism says, my nation is superior to all other nations, which means all other nations are inferior to my nation. So in other words, it's set up to otherize instantaneously, because by definition, a nationalist says everybody else is probably subhuman, right?
I'm afraid that complete nonsense is very common. It's just common in ethnic studies around the West, Maybe not as cheap as those ideas. There are a lot of serious scholars, but to define nationalism that way. May I give a counter view?
Well, what I'll say first is this guy's getting about 500,000 views on YouTube. So not only is he preaching his stuff to his students, and I'm sure this is happening in a lot of universities. I mean, there's plenty of accounts of the left basically controlling university systems here in Australia and elsewhere. But now he's got a platform on YouTube as well. And as I said, his approach is very effective. Even I was listening to it, and a lot of what he was saying was interesting, because he would give this bulk, thesis that would be interesting, but then the little nuggets every now and again. Please, give your counter argument to him.
Well, a good counter authority is Professor John Mearsheimer, University of Chicago, I think, who points out that the standard definition of nationalism, by the way, the world is organized according to nationalism. It's a powerful ideology. It's the ideology of self-rule, right? This is why nationalism was so deadly for these global empires that were broken up and destroyed in the 19th and early 20th century by nationalism, the spreading of this idea of nationalism. Nationalism is basically self-rule. If you want to rule yourself and you perceive your country as being a nation, then you're a nationalist. So nationalism is all about that. It's about, for example, we don't want to be ruled over by a foreign king or a foreign anybody, actually. We want to rule ourselves. Nationalism. That's nationalism. Now, one reason that left ideologues such as Mr. I almost want to say Cassandra. One reason I suspect people of the left much prefer patriotism is that patriotism is compatible with civic nationalism. Civic nationalism, because there are different forms of nationalism. There's religious nationalism, there's ethnic nationalism, there's cultural nationalism, and there's civic nationalism. Now, civic nationalism is where the person is expected to or does love the Constitution or love the form of government or love some aspect of the civil organization of that state. And feels protective, loves the monarchy, for example. That's getting a bit ethnic, though. That overlaps with identity, because kingdom in many countries, the monarchy actually reflects the history of the people. So, but just going back to mainstream, civic nationalism is what is officially recognized and approved by the mainstream media, by the universities, and by multicultural systems. The great thing about civic nationalism, if one is on the left, is that you can just pump in as many immigrants as you want, and they can become overnight civic nationalists like everyone else. It's just so wonderful, and therefore we can, social cohesion doesn't, from their perspective, social cohesion doesn't have to suffer. We can trust each other because we're all patriots together. We all die. We're all willing to die and fight for the state. And seeing these people, their ideology controls the state, that's rather convenient. So, but he made a wise point about patriotism, but it also applies to nationalism, and it applies to family loyalty, by the way, and tribal loyalty, which is ethnocentric, inward-looking concern for one's people, for one's family, or one's religion, does not necessarily have to cause hatred of other families or nations or religions. Right? So ethnocentrism can be just a positive, pro-social motivation. It can lead to, under certain circumstances. Imagine if one is ethnocentric, one loves one's people, one's family, or one's religion, or one's tribe, and that group is attacked and injured in some way by an invading party. Well, it's only, it would be easy, and it is easy for people to develop a dislike of the invader. So love can lead to hatred, right? If you're protecting the people you love and the categories you love, it can lead to hatred. But nationalism is basically about self-rule. That's the core of it. All this notion of superiority and everything. Now, where that comes from, credibly, I'll try and salvage something from what the professor said. If one is ethnocentric, ethnocentrism typically goes with favorable views about one's own children. Right? I've got the greatest kids on earth, but then I have a rational mind which tells me, hold on a moment, hold on. I doubt that my children happen to be the most superior children on earth. I just love them. Okay. But ethnocentrism tends to lead people to develop positive images of their family, tribe, religion. Okay. So it is a weakness. It is a weakness in human nature. It's a tendency we need to be on guard against, because it can lead to feelings of superiority when it's not justified. On the other hand, some cultures are superior. So, for example, in military terms, one reason that one culture can reliably win wars against another culture is that it has better military technology, a stronger economy. Why? Because it might be a superior economy. The superiority can be true. It can be false. It depends on the circumstance. But
we see the same thing in sport.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Some athletes are superior. Why run away from these words? They serve a function. Some athletes are superior in the sense of being faster runners. And if you're in a sprint race, that's pretty important, actually. One can talk about, but the person has redeeming features. He's a good father. And you say, that's all true, but we're discussing the race, a sprint race. In a sprint race, if you can run faster, you're superior. Oh, there's such a harsh word. I think there's a lot of irrationality going on in our elite culture, because it lacks opposition. It's lacked, until recently, lacked opposition. And now, on an optimistic note, things are changing. People are hearing alternatives via the internet. It's a bit chaotic. Yes, there's misinformation, but there's also a lot of truth being said. And a lot of the mainstream media is just dying. It's just dying. Like some of the jokes, like CNN is so biased, so propagandistic, It's almost like watching our own ABC in Australia. I mean, it's almost as bad as that.
Yeah.
And they're dying. They're losing market share. Individual journalists like Tucker Carlson have several times the audience as some of these major platforms. It's a good thing.
That's right. Look, Dr. Salter, I'm grateful for your time today. I do want to squeeze in one more question, because in your book, Anglophobia, you made the point that British societies in particular mostly rejected a victimhood status. I mean, you talk about the stiff upper lip in British culture, where they rejected portraying themselves as victims, but the left love victimhood and they use it as a political tool. How do the left exploit victimhood to manipulate political power?
Well, this is at the core of the strategy of identity politics, where one finds, and it's the left have been very successful. They've been very good at this, finding a minority that has grievances, building up those grievances, sympathizing with them, giving them resources that that minority might not have had, intellectual resources, for example, media resources, right? And exploiting that. And they've just done a very good job in prosecuting their brand of politics as a result, by finding a victim. And then, of course, if there's a victim, there has to be a perpetrator. You can't have a victim without a perpetrator, and so on. Where I obviously I'm critical. I'm very critical, because I think that a lot of this is invention. Not always. For example, Western intellectuals who sympathized with cultures that have been colonized by their own country, by the West, by France or by Britain or whatever, and lending ideological support, I can see the redeeming aspects in there. I don't like the idea of colonialism. I think society should be free, should be self-governing. So I call myself a universal nationalist. I'm a universal nationalist in the sense I think everyone should, to the extent possible, forge their own destinies and govern themselves, choose their leaders from among their ranks.
Yes, well, this is where I disagree with this Roy Casagrande, where he's saying that if you're a nationalist, you think all other nations are subhuman. Well, no. I just want my nation to be strong, and I want to, as you said, choose my own leaders, and I want it to have a strong economy and a strong social structure. You want it to be peaceful, etc., etc., etc. But you also want other countries to be like that as well. I want China to be successful. I want India to be successful. I want the United States and England and France and all the countries, Russia, I want them to be successful as well, because hopefully if all countries are successful and happy and thriving, then we will have less conflict in the world and less hatred between different countries. But to push this idea that if you're a nationalist, then you look down on everyone else, I mean, it just makes no sense at all.
It's bizarre. And isn't it bizarre that someone, obviously an intelligent, well-educated person, or thoroughly educated anyway, can say such a thing? I mean, this is ideology. I haven't listened to more. I've only listened to the segment that
there's some whoppers in there. I mean, I can't play them all, but every now and again, I would be just, yeah.
It's just ideology. I mean, it's just ridiculous that someone as intelligent as this professor could say such a thing. But I can tell you, it's commonplace. Nationalism is evil, but patriotism's okay. I mean, really. I mean, this is just nonsense. Of course, Joseph Stalin became patriotic during the course of World War II. He became a patriot. He was the worst mass murderer in history, or close to it. He delighted in sadistic, torturing, having his opponents tortured to death and all the rest of it. He was a bloody mass murderer but he was also a patriot. Does that make patriotism's evil? No, the world is complicated. Similarly, Adolf Hitler was a type of socialist. He was a type of socialist, and he was also a mass murderer, a mass murderer. So are we meant to judge all socialists by, that extreme example? No. So there ideologies can be professed by people who live exemplary lives and those who lead the opposite sort of criminal lives. So, but that's not what we're discussing. What we're discussing is what is best for the long-term future of humankind. And I don't think homogenizing the world communities and having a world government is going to optimize our futures. I think even though a universal nationalist formula where we promoted people governing themselves, there'll still be conflict. Some tragedy will result from that, but I believe less than if we homogenize, if we just destroy diversity around the world. All countries, when you think about it, diversity requires borders. If we don't have borders where people can decide who comes in and who doesn't, forget diversity. It'll be one homogeneous grey mass. So I think there are big issues here that have not been well enough discussed in the mainstream media.
Well, they are big issues, and we could talk about this for another 3 hours if we wanted to. And it's probably a good reason to have you back on the podcast in the future, because there are tremendous amount of issues that we could discuss, but also your research and knowledge goes back through decades of work that you've done. So thank you for giving us a piece of it today. To let everyone know, if you want to know more about Dr. Salter and the British Australian community, just head to their website, as I mentioned before, the British Australian Community.com.au. You can sign up for membership. I think membership is about $25 a year. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah. What does that get people to sign up for membership?
Well, we've been in the last year, we've produced, I'd say, 50 videos. So we have a large number of educational videos out there. We've produced a number of books in recent years. There's Anglophobia, which I co-authored with Harry Richardson, who's currently president of the BAC. There's a short book, a half-length book, we published just a month ago on Amazon and as Kindle and paperback on the referendum, on the voice referendum. And I know that the referendum is over, but there's a lot of interesting material in there. I do recommend that people have a look. There's some novel positions. For example, looking at the long-term relationship between Anglo-Australia and Indigenous Australia, and also looking at how the Aboriginal movement works with and has been basically captured in large part, not completely, large part captured by the multicultural movement. So multicultural elites have stepped in as advisors, and I think had a deleterious effect on the Indigenous liberation movement. So looking at that, there are some interesting points raised there. So I recommend that. And there's a book by Harry Richardson himself. He published many years ago now, called The Life of Muhammad. I think The Life of Muhammad, about Islam, a history of Islam. And there's a book that I'm working on now, which will be my third collected essays, this time on the national question. So on everything we've been discussing today, there are 89 chapters. It's in production. It should be out within 2 months.
Yeah, well, that'll be very interesting. I'm still trying to get through Anglophobia, which is I think 200 pages long or something. But to find the time for all this stuff is challenging, but I think it's important as well. I mean, we need to be across these issues, and we can't shy away from them. We need to be able to have adult conversations about this stuff without the left just putting their narrative out there and trying to silence people from talking about this stuff by calling them racists or bigots or far right extremists or whatever it might be. That's infiltrated our politics now, where even prime ministers are speaking that language. So we need to be able to resist that by, as I said, having adult conversations about these issues. Are we going to be 100% right all the time? Well, I don't think it's about being right or wrong. It's about trying to flesh these things out and understanding why we as humans react the way that we do and what's important to us and what we're driven by and those sorts of things. So I think you've done an excellent job to at least going part of that way of trying to better understand why we as humans act the way that we do and why we react in certain circumstances like we've just seen recently in the UK. So thank you very much, Dr. Salter.
You're welcome, Stephen.
And if I say it every single time, if you want to share this out, please do so. We rely on our audience to share these interviews out. I'm not the maestro at social media, so I think these conversations are very, very important. So if you can, please share this out everywhere. Share it on social media. Put it in email list. Put it in people's inboxes on social media platforms. Be much appreciated because, as I said, we do rely on our audience to get this message out and to share our conversations. So thank you, everyone, for watching, and we'll see you all next time. See you later.